The time is exactly 9:50. Welcome back. We're into our final interview for the morning, and we are now going to be talking with Futurist, Economist, and Business Trends Analyst at Flux Trends. She's Bronwyn Williams, and she's here to talk to us about the impact of declining global birth rates. Bronwyn, a very, very good morning to you, and welcome. In this day and age, the 21st century, I'm kind of wondering the issues around declining global birth rates. Why is it important, and what sort of impacts are we looking at in terms of this situation?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting one. We've started seeing this sort of shift from everybody being too concerned about overpopulation issues, which we've heard about a lot. In fact, we still hear about it from a lot of our international bodies quite a lot. But what we're really starting to see now is that for many countries, they're actually tipping into the opposite problem, actually having quite low birth replacement rates. And this is quite significant political and economic effects for most of our societies, particularly as we are living in quite a comfortable period of history overall, in that many of us live in countries that have quite generous social security entitlements, things like old age pensions and state-secured medical health plans like the NHI we're trying to do here in South Africa. And most of those sort of massive social security entitlement schemes do rely on a pipeline of productive young people to effectively prop them up, because most of these systems are not fully funded. In other words, I don't pay for myself, rather future generations will pay for me, and I'll be paying for older generations to access the benefits of those services. So if we start to have a declining population, even if it's starting very, very slowly now, it means that for people that are planning on having quite long lives, it means that they might not be having the same degree of financial and physical security and safety from those entitlement schemes that they might have relied on. And this, of course, can lead to huge social instability, and it's already starting to come through in terms of intergenerational conflict. So if you kind of want an image to hold in your mind about what's happening, is that traditionally we've had kind of population pyramids. So you had very few old people and quite a lot of young people. They're sort of quite steeply steepled off towards the end, but they're almost changing in shape now to be more like population pagodas. They have this sort of carved out bottom, which is quite unstable. And that's really what we're starting to see there. Of course, these problems are much deeper or much further advanced. The population pyramids have changed shape a lot more in your older societies, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia like Japan. In fact, Japan's the most precarious in that sort of this sort of line of thought that we're talking about. But even here in Africa, we tend to think we've got a lot of young people who might actually have a youth bulge and quite a robust population pyramid. Your listeners and viewers might be interested to know that in South Africa, we are only just above the birth replacement rate in terms of our fertility levels. That means that women are having only just enough children to replace themselves and their partners in society, which means that it doesn't take very long. In fact, it won't take many decades at all before we're also going to be grappling with these shifting population dynamics and some of those risks that I mentioned, particularly in the financial sphere going forward. And of course, the next point to consider there is how we then feel about immigration, which is very, very interesting, because in all those countries that I mentioned, particularly those older aging populations, we are starting to have these more precarious population pyramids. They've traditionally not been very friendly towards immigration. Japan is notorious for not actually letting people resettle into their territories, and places like Europe too have been in the media a lot for gatekeeping their parts of the world and actually keeping younger, youthful job seekers and productive young people out of their borders. Unfortunately, we're starting to see the same trends play out here in South Africa, as we're starting to see a nationalist turn across almost all of our political parties at the moment, talking about putting South Africans first and putting up walls and borders, all very sort of Trumpian type ideology and narrative that's coming through. But we should think carefully about those sorts of narratives, because actually what we really want is a growing, thriving economy on a global and a local level. And that might mean having to rethink what is ours and who we are and how generous we are with sharing our future with our neighbors.
Okay, so as you were speaking, it's actually concerning, is it not? Because in 20 or 50 years' time, we're going to have a larger, older population and a smaller, diminished younger population, which is obviously going to have a direct impact on our social and economic lives as well. There aren't going to be enough young people in the workplace, in the police force,
Mm-hmm.
in construction industry, etc., etc., etc. And also with an older population, they are more dependent on your health services and other such services. Um, it doesn't bode well for not only South Africa, but all around the world. What we're also seeing a few years ago, I had heard, I think it was in Germany, that has a declining young population and an older population, and they were then encouraging immigration. Uh, so there's going to be a lot of movement of people all around the world. It's very unsettling, is it not? Uh, why is it important that we start preparing? What should we be doing? And what can business do? At the same time, Bronwyn, I'm also thinking, what about the environment? Do these type of issues have a huge impact on our environment globally?
Yeah, sure. I think the thing to note there is that how we sort of start dealing with this from a policy perspective is either we can reconsider immigration policy and be more welcoming of younger, productive people coming into our spaces. The other way that governments are trying to deal with that is by manipulating incentives to have children in the first place. There are now many countries across the world who are actually paying people to have children. I mean, even just family-based tax credits can be seen as a direct incentive to keep having children. But other countries have gone even further than that, actually paying out lump sums if you do have a child. And this is almost a more sort of nationalistic way of dealing with this, rather than a more sort of globalist perspective on how to deal with the shifting population dynamics. And of course, as you mentioned, population dynamics are closely related with environmental issues because, of course, population is a real problem. It's to do with demand and supply and how much access each of us as individuals or as greater societies have to the natural resources, of which there's also a finite endowment on planet Earth, notwithstanding that we might be able to get a little bit more from out of space when we start engaging in space tourism and those sorts of things. But the story about population and why we have been concerned about population figures is always a story of scarcity and always a story of growth. And it's always quite a fine balance to find. On the one hand, you have to make sure that you are not overextending your population too much, that you are overshooting your natural resource bounds and leading to a sort of overexpansion and collapse event. But at the same time, you also kind of need a growing population in order to have growth and progress. Now, populations that have younger, healthier, working populations do tend to grow faster. These are the sort of demographic dividend good news stories that we like to hear all over the place. But of course, none of those demographic dividends are guaranteed. They need a few prerequisites. You need an educated and employable young population that is actually working in the workplace. So if you've got a youth bulge like we have in South Africa, coupled with a high unemployment rate, we sort of compounding these problems even more because we don't just have old age dependents on our social security entitlement schemes. We've also got young dependents on those schemes who simply don't have a place in our economies. So yes, always thinking about population in terms of both sustainability and in terms of progress, and trying to find a balance between those things is very, very difficult because, of course, our fertility choices are up to us as individuals. And historically, governments trying to manipulate people's fertility choices have ended up making quite often more harm than good. And of course, China is the classic case study there. They instituted their very brutal one-child policy. And what they ended up doing was now getting to the point, fast forward a couple of decades, where they now have a underpopulation problem. And now they're also looking at ways to incentivize families having slightly more children. So again, it's a very complicated, messy problem. But the reason why we look at population figures from a futures and a foresight perspective is that, as we like to say, it's sort of heuristic, that demography is quite often destiny, because those population trends are quite slow moving. If women in my generation haven't had their first children by the time they're in their mid-30s, then that's going to have a material impact that you can't actually fix, that you're going to have to deal with in 10, 20, 30 years' time when it comes to how we're going to look after this current generation, and so on and so forth.
So, Bronwyn, two quick questions before we wrap up is, we've been told by futurists like yourselves, like Flux Trends, that older people, or, the older generation are living longer because of, obviously, the quality of life has improved all around the world. So people are living longer. How does that impact on this plan? And when we talk about, the aging population, uh, as futurists, how do you see this playing out? Is this going to start? Are we going to start seeing this in the next 10, 20, or 30 years' time? What are the predictions?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking there. That was quite a lot that you were saying there. What's
Okay.
the actual
Question number one. All right. Question number one is people are living longer, possibly 10 years longer than they were 50 years ago, because quality of life has improved. How does that impact on this scenario? And obviously, question number two is, when do we see this starting to play out? Immediately, or in 10, 20, or 30 years' time?
Well, the longer people live, the more of those pressures there are on those entitlements, the longer that we have to support people that we might need social security safety nets for. So it just sort of enhances all these trends we've been talking about. It means that once again, the top of that pyramid becomes heavier and the bottom in comparison becomes looser. In terms of how fast these things play out, well, it's an evolving story. This is the story of humanity. It changes from day to day. And every generation has to deal with a different sort of shift. And previous generations were dealing with quite rapid exponential population growth. We're now going to have to start changing gears and start thinking about a population that has mixed speeds of growth, where some parts of the world are growing much faster, because places like Nigeria, for example, are absolutely still growing at quite a rapid rate and have a very robust bottom base of the population pyramid. Whereas other parts of the world, including us in South Africa, which is actually quite a developed, almost sort of first world story when it comes to population demographics, do have to start changing gears and thinking about shifting into a world where perhaps population growth rates can't be guaranteed upon to prop up economic growth or to service all the debt that all of our economies are currently running on.
Interesting indeed. Thank you for your insights. Obviously, we were talking with Bronwyn Williams, a futurist, economist, and business trends analyst at Flux Trends. Always lovely talking to you guys. Haven't hooked up with you a long time, but this was something we needed to understand. So thank you, go well, and all the very best to you.
Thank you very much.
The time is exactly 3:10. We're wrapping up. Thank you for your company on the show this morning. Also, a big thank you to our producer, Nasreen Naidu, for all her hard work. Till next week, Monday at the same time, as always. Don't forget the COVID protocols, and please take care on the roads. Assalamu